Hello, thank you for joining me here today at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I am talking about Catch Me If You Can, The True Story of a Real Fake by Frank Abagnale Jr. and Stan Redding, published in 1980, and I'm comparing it with the movie directed by Steven Spielberg, Catch Me If You Can, which was released in 2002. And this is another subscriber September episode, so this one was requested by Muzartney. So Muzartney, thank you so much for requesting this one, and I hope you enjoy my video. But before I get into Catch Me If You Can, two things. First of all, I want to apologize for the Halloween decorations behind me. I should have decorated after I filmed this video, but I wasn't really thinking, and so I already had decorated before filming this one, and so it just feels so out of place because there is nothing Halloween or spooky about this story, so it seems so random that I'm talking about it with Halloween decorations behind me, so I apologize. But I do have some exciting Halloween-themed book versus movie episodes coming up, so if you have not subscribed, you definitely should, and hit the notification bell. That way you can watch these episodes as soon as they are released. But secondly, for any of my OG fans, you might be like, Catch Me If You Can? Haven't you already covered that? In which case the answer is yes, I did cover this back in 2021. It was spring of 2021, so it was a while ago now. And that was when I only recorded these as a podcast episode. So I have uploaded the audio on YouTube, but it is just the audio. So since this was requested, and since it's been a while since I covered it, and since it is only available as audio, I thought I would re-record the episode as an actual video. And full disclosure, I rewatched the movie in preparation for this. However, I did not reread the book. So what I have to say about the book is based on what I remember, as well as what I wrote about this back in 2021. But Catch Me If You Can, it is the true story, which in 2023, earlier this year, there was an article that came out exposing Abagnale for the lies he told, which we will get into. But for most of this episode, I'm going to talk about it as if Abagnale was telling the truth. And then at the end of the episode, I'll get into that article explaining about the lies he told. Anyway, so Catch Me If You Can is the true story of Frank Abagnale, who between the ages of 16 and 21, he pretended to be a pilot, a lawyer, a college professor, a doctor, and he forged and cashed millions of dollars worth of checks. And then eventually he was caught by the FBI. But then after serving time in prison, he then went on to work for the FBI and working with different banks to help them catch forgeries and help them to prevent people from being able to forge checks the way he did. And this story has become so famous that it has even become a musical play, which I have not seen, but if you have, let me know your thoughts. I love musicals, so I think I would probably enjoy this one, but yeah, so that's kind of cool. But on to my book review. So I listed Stan Redding as an author as well, and based on what I read, Stan Redding is the author of this book. He was the ghostwriter, so Abagnale did not actually write this himself. So with this first critique I'm going to talk about, I don't know if it is the fault of Abagnale or if it is just on Redding, but this book had a very cocky air about it, and it got pretty annoying where it just felt like he was constantly bragging, especially when he talked about the woman he slept with. Sometimes these details related to the overall story, but other times it was just him bragging about women he slept with and how cool he was and everything he got away with. And so just that cocky air that the book had got so annoying. But then at the end of the book that I read, there was this interview portion, which was from a while after the book was released. And in that section, Abagnale did not come across cocky at all. So it could either be the fact that he matured through the years, or it's, maybe he was never cocky to begin with, but Stan Redding just wrote the book in that way. Not really sure. But then also near the end of the book, he eventually gets caught and he serves time in different prisons in different countries. And I felt like that part kind of dragged on a bit too much because the story started to drag at that point. But up until then, despite my complaints, overall it was an entertaining read and it did, keep a good pace. But again, I did really like reading that interview at the end of the book. And in that interview, Abagnale, he is talking about the fame he has received due to these exploits from when he was a teenager. And he says, I'm actually not totally amazed at the things I did as a kid. I look at it as I was a kid who ran away. I got into a lot of mischief. I was very creative. I did those things. I got caught. I served my time. And now I have been at the FBI for 35 years. I've developed technologies that are used all over the world to combat fraud. I've been married to my one and only wife for 38 years. I am absolutely amazed when I look back on my life at that. And so I thought it was kind of nice that out of the things he's achieved in life, he feels his greatest achievement is the marriage to his wife, which he met his wife when he was in Houston, and at the time he was working undercover with the FBI, and so when he met her, he had to lie about his identity, which of course is very reminiscent to when he lied to previous women about his identity. However, in the past he lied because he was doing something illegal, whereas obviously here he was having to lie for a very different reason. But as far as the movie goes, I absolutely love this movie. This was only my second time watching it, but yeah, the performances are fantastic. I love Leonardo DiCaprio. I am so excited for Killers of the Flower Moon. But yeah, so I love the casting. I love DiCaprio. I love Tom Hanks. Christopher Walken was amazing as Frank Abagnale Sr., and he actually got an Academy Award nomination for this role, which was well deserved. And DiCaprio, it's funny because he was 26 at the time. So he was 26 playing a 16-year-old who was pretending to be in his 20s. Tom Hanks, of course, plays the FBI agent who is trying to catch DiCaprio / Abagnale. And the FBI aspect is much more prominent in the movie because the book, again, it's written from Abagnale's perspective. So we never get anything from the perspective of the FBI agent. And there wasn't really like one specific agent that was on his tail that he had this relationship with. The guy who caught him, he is called O'Reilly in the book, but he called him O'Reilly because the guy was still in the FBI and he couldn't use his real name. So his real name was Joe Shia. So that's the name of the guy who caught him and who was like tracking him. But it wasn't like, he wasn't specifically tracking him the way it shows in the movie. Which actually, this role was actually meant for James Gandolfini. However, due to scheduling conflicts, Gandolfini had to back out. And Spielberg wanted to offer the role to Tom Hanks, but he was really hesitant because 2002, Tom Hanks was huge. And he was like, this is only a supporting role. Like, I can't ask Tom Hanks to do this. Like, it's not the leading role. But then he asked Hanks anyway. And basically, Tom Hanks was like, hey, I don't care if a role is big or small. Like, a great character is a great character. And that's what matters to me. So I thought that was cool. And Tom Hanks has always just had that vibe of just being so likable. And so this story just kind of adds to that friendly Tom Hanks vibe that you imagine with him. But from here on out, I'm going to get into the details of the plot, which means I will be getting into spoilers. So I'm going to start with his family. So one of the reasons I love this movie is because the family aspect, right? Where Frank, when he's on the run, he's constantly trying to get his parents back together, but he's also trying to find like a replacement family, right? He feels like he used to have this perfect family childhood, and he's just trying to capture that and get it all over again, which is interesting because really, like, his family was never perfect to begin with, right? Like, he had this idea of his parents having this fairy tale romance and they were so perfect together, but really, like, that wasn't even the reality of it though. He was just too young to see the reality. But regardless, he keeps trying to like recreate what he thought his parents had had. And the reason he runs away when he's 16 is because in the movie, he comes home and there's a lawyer there and his parents are getting a divorce because his mom has been having an affair. And so they tell him like, hey, your parents are splitting up. You need to choose who you want to live with. And Frank like can't bear to make this decision. And so he runs away instead. Whereas in real life, for starters, he was not an only child. He had 3 siblings. And his dad, like, they were very well off, which we see in the movie that the dad is well off. However, he like gets fired or loses his job for some reason. They have to move to a smaller apartment and they end up living a poorer life. But anyway, when his parents were together, his dad was well off and he would often be gone either because he was at the bars, not drinking, but he would go to the bars like to socialize for work. But then he was also an avid saltwater fisherman, so he was constantly gone on these fishing trips too. And the mom obviously was unhappy, and so while he was gone on one of these fishing trips, she packed up the kids and moved into an apartment. And this was when Frank was 12, and when he was 14 is when the divorce was finalized. And out of his siblings, he chose to stay with his father because he was closer to his dad than his mom. And so he went to live with his dad, and this was a difficult time for him because his dad really wanted to get the mom back, and he would use Frank as a go-between. And so over time, Frank and his mom started to resent the fact that the dad was putting Frank in the middle of things, which is very different from the movie, because in the movie, Frank is the one who was telling his dad, like, hey, like, you gotta call mom, you gotta do this, you gotta do that, like, you have to try to get her back. Whereas in the book, that wasn't the case, and the dad was like using Frank as a go-between. And then in the movie, we see that the dad becomes a post office worker, and this happens in real life as well. And it is when he is living with his father, where his father loses his affluent job and he ends up becoming a postal worker. And this is really hard for Frank to see. He doesn't know why in real life. He doesn't know why his dad lost his job, because in real life, he says that his dad was a very honest person. And so it's just kind of a mystery, not really sure. But anyway, it was hard for Frank to see his dad be like, demoted in life, right? Like he loses his wife, he loses his job, he loses his nice car. And so it was just very depressing for Frank to see this. And it was just this whole experience that by the age of 16, he decides to run away. Whereas in the movie, we see that his dad was not honest the way he was in the book, and that he himself was a bit of a con man, right? And so we see that that is where Frank gets it from, although Frank obviously takes it to a whole nother level. But then his mom, in real life, she actually went on to become a dental hygienist, whereas in the movie, we don't really see her getting a new job. We just see her end up marrying the guy she had been cheating on the dad with. And yeah, the mom is not portrayed very good in the movie because in real life, even though he lived with his dad, his mom was still a big part of his life. Whereas, yeah, in the movie, his mom is cheating on his dad for one, and then they get a divorce and they put him in this situation where he has to choose, and then he runs away. And yeah, the mom just doesn't seem to be a big part of his life, really. And it's his dad after, when he's out conning, doing his thing, his dad is the one he keeps reaching out to. But yeah, in real life, the mom wasn't having an affair. And so it's interesting actually to watch this now that I've seen The Fabelmans and that I've learned more about Steven Spielberg and his life, because Steven Spielberg's mom was having an affair on Spielberg's dad. And so it does seem like Spielberg was kind of inserting his own story to some extent into this story of Abagnale. And this whole family theme just wasn't even as much of a thing in the book. And so it is interesting, even though this is a story about Frank Abagnale, it's interesting to see how much of Spielberg is in this movie as well, But then, yeah, going back to his mom in real life, she didn't even get remarried until 20 years after the divorce. And at that point, the dad had passed away anyway, which to talk about the dad passing away. So this is a big scene in the movie because he has just been taken out of the prison in France and he's on the plane home and he is telling Hanratty, which is the Tom Hanks character, how he's excited to call his dad. And that's when Hanratty is like, actually, your dad passed away. I'm so sorry to be the one to tell you this. And this causes Frank to have a bit of a nervous breakdown, and then he escapes out of the plane and he runs away. Whereas in real life, his dad died when he was in an American prison. And this was a shock and it was really difficult for him. And he missed the funeral because he was in prison. So it was a really difficult time, but it wasn't quite like it was in the movie. And also his dad dying when he was in jail, that's not even something that was talked about in the book. That's actually something that came up in the interview, which was done a long time after the book was even released. But yeah, as the movie shows, he was really close to his dad. But in the movie, we see, like I said, that he keeps contacting his dad even while he's pretending to do all these things. Whereas in real life, he did not talk to his family for 5 years. He didn't talk to his parents at all. And the first time he talked to them after running away was after his arrest in France. They got him out of the French prison and brought him back to America. And when he landed in America, before going into the American prison system, he ended up calling each of them individually and talking to them. And I assume he apologized. I assume he apologized in this phone call, but he did say that when his dad passed away, he regretted that he didn't get a chance to apologize as much as he would have liked for all of the heartache he caused his father. But to talk about his various jobs that he had. So when he ran away at 16, he ended up getting just regular odd jobs. However, he was paid very little and he was wanting to take girls out and he needed money to take girls out on dates. And so he was like, man, I need to find a way to make more money. And he assumed the reason he was paid so little was because of how young he was. And so he changed his ID to make himself 10 years older. However, he still wasn't paid much. And when he asked this new employer why he wasn't getting paid as much, the guy told him that it's because he did not have a high school diploma. And so Frank is just feeling kind of dejected about this when he then sees a pilot walking with some stewardesses, and he's just so taken with how cool this pilot looks. And that's when he decides he wants to quote unquote become a pilot. And him getting the odd jobs is not in the movie, but we do see him see the pilot with a stewardess. And so it's kind of a similar moment in both book and movie when he decides that he wants to become a pilot. But in book and movie, we see the different ways he pulled this off. So he pretends to be a high school student interviewing a pilot. And so he's able to get all kinds of information in this interview. And then he also takes the stickers off of Pan Am toy planes. And in the movie, he puts these stickers on the checks, whereas in real life, he had used that sticker on his ID. But then he also calls the uniform makers, telling them he is a pilot who has lost his uniform and he needs a new one. So that is how he is able to get that. And then in the movie, we see when he is like pretending to interview the pilot, he asks him, what does it mean when someone asks, what equipment are you on? Whereas in real life, he did not think to ask that, but he had his Pan Am uniform and he would just like hang out at airports just to like get the feel of things. And there was like a pilot's bar he would go to. And one day he's sitting at this pilot's bar and a pilot comes up and he's like, hey, like, what kind of equipment are you working on? And Frank has no idea what this guy is talking about. So he says General Electric. And then the pilot is kind of like, he feels like Frank is just being like sarcastic or something. And so he's annoyed. And then Frank feels awkward. So he excuses himself. And then while he's like walking through the airport, he sees a stewardess who needs some help lifting something. So he's helping her out and he starts talking to her and he's like, oh, like, what equipment are you on? And she tells him that she is on 707s. And so it is through this experience that he learns what that phrase means. And the book also explains what deadheading is. So like when you're a pilot and your airline needs you to be in a different city, that way you can fly out of that city, you get a free ride on like whatever airline is available. And in the movie, it seems like this just happened coincidentally where he shows up at an airport and they're like, oh, you're the deadhead to Miami. And he's just like, sure. Whereas in the book, this was like a purposeful thing that he learned about and went to go do. And so he flew all over the place for free, being a deadhead passenger. And he never went to airports that Pan Am flew out of because he was too nervous about being caught. But he has been pretending to be a pilot for like a year and on these different flights. When one flight he is on, he overhears the radio that they are asking about him, about this pilot who is pretending to be a pilot and who is deadheading on flights. And after the flight lands, the federal agents show up and arrest him and they take him to this room to question him. But he is very convincing, being like, you got the wrong guy, it's not me. And they are so convinced that they let him go. However, after this, he is like, wow, that was a close call. And so after this, he stops pretending to be a pilot and he is in Atlanta. And so he decides to just lay low in Atlanta. Whereas in the movie, we don't get that scene and we don't really see him making a clear point to stop pretending to be a pilot. We just kind of see that he is, living in some apartment, having a party, living it up. And then he just sort of happens to then move on to pretending to be a doctor. But in real life, so he was applying for an apartment in Atlanta and it asked what his job was and he just kind of randomly was like a pediatrician. But he tells them that he is currently on sabbatical. And he has plenty of cash from his Pan Am checks and so he is good to go and so he's just living life. And then one day the landlord introduces him to another guy in the building who is also a doctor. And Frank initially is like, I got to get out of here because this guy's going to find out that I'm a fraud. However, this other doctor like never talks shop and he's also enjoyable to be around. So Frank is like, oh, like, okay, I don't need to leave after all. And so he becomes friends with this doctor. And over time, the doctor is like, hey, like you should check out the hospital I work at. And so Frank becomes like known around the hospital because he is friends with this doctor. And he will also pop in often to go to the hospital library because he's like, I should be reading up on what I claim to be doing for work. And so he's at the hospital a lot, so much so that he starts dating a nurse there named Brenda. And then one day the doctor, he tells him like, hey, we have this other doctor who is going to be out of town for 10 days for a funeral. Like, could you just cover for those 10 days? He's on the night shift and we have interns doing most of the work. So it'll be super easy. I promise you'd be doing me a huge favor. And Frank is very hesitant, but he kind of likes the thought of, this new challenge. And he's like, oh, interns will be doing it all anyway, so it'll be fine. So he says yes. Whereas in the movie, like I said, he's just kind of like living his life. And then he goes to the hospital to like pick someone up. And then he meets Brenda and then he randomly is like, hey, like I'm a doctor. Are you hiring? So he like asks for the job in the movie. Whereas in the real life, it just kind of landed in his lap. But in the book, he says that the way he got away with pretending to be a doctor for so long was just that he had a very flippant attitude and was always joking. And he would do this that way when he said something like sincerely. If he was wrong, people wouldn't take him seriously and they would just think he was joking. And so he was able to pass off a lot of things as a joke. But this like original 10-day job, the doctor who left, he ended up quitting. And then it took them forever to hire a new doctor. So what was supposed to be a 10-day temporary job, he ended up doing for 9 months. And initially, like, it was fine, but near the end, he was definitely getting antsy, being like, oh, like, I really want you guys to find someone new. I didn't intend this to be permanent. And also, like, he's starting to realize just how serious it is to pretend to be a doctor, right? Like, people's lives are in your hands. And so he just starts to feel very, like, antsy about wanting to get out of this. And he is also very squeamish around blood, which we do see in the movie when he throws up after having to see someone who has been injured. But in both book and movie, like I said, he dates the nurse named Brenda. In the movie, Brenda appears to be like late teens, early 20s. She seems very young. And she takes him to go meet her parents who were in New Orleans. And while there, her dad is a lawyer. And so Frank lies. And he's like, oh, I'm a doctor, but I also have a law degree. And I'm like wanting to get back into that. And so that is how he segues from being a doctor to being a lawyer. And also when he's with Brenda's parents, he just sees that, again, this ideal family he's looking for. It seems like Brenda's parents have this perfect relationship. And so he just wants to be part of this family. And so he and Brenda end up being engaged. And a big part of the movie is, because he passed the bar in New Orleans. And so a big part of the movie is Tom Hanks' character being like, how do you do it? Like, you didn't really pass. So like, how did you do this? How did you fake it? But it turns out when it's revealed that he really did pass. He studied for 2 weeks super hard, and then he took the test and he passed. And that's like kind of true to the book. But in the book, he studied for like 4 months. And it seems like he took it multiple times too. But eventually he legitimately did pass the test. But in the movie, while he's with Brenda and her family, the FBI find out about his engagement and they end up crashing the engagement party, and so he has to run away. Whereas in real life, the reason he runs away, he's not even engaged to Brenda, by the way. In the book, they were just casually dating. But in the book, he claims to have a Harvard law degree and everything's going fine until, like, in his social circle, this new Harvard guy shows up, and this Harvard alum wants to talk just about Harvard. And so Frank knows nothing about Harvard. And so he decides that he needs to move before this guy gets suspicious. And something kind of like this happens in the movie where the dad is suspicious of Frank. And he's like, who are you really? Like, tell me the truth. And Frank tells him in the movie, like, I'm not a doctor. I'm not a lawyer. I'm just a man who loves your daughter. And rather than being upset, the dad is like, oh, that's okay. You're a romantic. So am I. Like, it's fine. And this was kind of similar to a part in the book with his dad, where when he lived with his dad, he was doing this con that cost his dad a lot of money. And when his dad caught him, he told his dad, like, sorry, I wanted money to take girls out, and that's why I did this. But rather than be upset, the dad is just like, oh, you're a romantic, that's fine, I totally get it, and he doesn't get in any trouble. But yeah, to talk about his relationship. So in the book, he's dating Brenda, who's 30 years old, but it doesn't go anything beyond like dating, and he doesn't meet her family or anything. But then later on, he's in the Bay Area and he meets a woman named Rosalie, and she is the one that he actually falls for. And she suggests that they go meet her parents who live in LA. And she had previously told him that she was not going to have sex before marriage. But on this drive down to LA, they stop at a hotel and he ends up convincing her to go through with it. And so they end up having sex, and then he meets her parents. And so she thinks like this is all adding up to them eventually getting married. However, he never actually proposes and he wasn't thinking about marriage. But when they meet the parents, like she basically tells them that they are engaged. And so they start planning a wedding, even though Frank never actually proposed. But Frank was in love with her. And so one day he decides to tell her the truth. And after he tells her, like they're somewhere else, and he tells her like, hey, like you go ahead and go home and I'll meet you there. And then when he shows up to the house, he sees a cop car in front of the house and he realizes that Rosalie had told the cops on him and they are there waiting to arrest him. And so then he leaves and never goes back. Which, way to be subtle, just parked in front of the house, like not even trying to hide. But anyway, so he felt very betrayed. But honestly, he kind of like was messed up and manipulative with her, it sounds like, by convincing her to have sex with him, even though she didn't want to do that until they were married. And then when she thinks that that means they will get married, he's kind of surprised, being like, oh, wait, what? But again, I guess, he was a teenager, so he was just sort of immature anyway. But anyway, on to the movie. So in the movie, he is with Brenda, and like I said, they get engaged. But then at the engagement party, the FBI shows up. So he tells her before he leaves, he's like, hey, this is the truth. This is my real name. And if you love me, like meet me at the Miami airport in 2 days at 10 a.m. and don't tell anybody. And she says, okay. And so then 2 days later, he goes to the Miami airport and he sees Brenda there. However, he also sees some like undercover FBI people. And so he drives away. So like in real life, he had confided in a woman telling her the truth, but then she kind of betrayed him in both versions. And then also in the book, he falls for this French stewardess who flies for Air France. And he finds out that her dad owns a printing press. And so it is with the help of her dad that he is able to print out more checks. The dad, though, doesn't realize that what he's doing is illegal, so Frank gets him to help out while keeping him in the dark. Whereas in the movie, he goes to France, meaning Frank, he goes to France, and it seems like he just has this like printing shop set up and is just printing checks on his own, and there is no French stewardess and there is no, French dad that's helping him. And in the movie, it seems like he went to France. He went to that specific town in France because that is where his parents met. So he had like sentimental reasons for doing it. And then it is while he is in this town that Hanratty catches him and he is arrested by the French police. Whereas in the book, it wasn't necessarily sentimental reasons, although while he's in France, he does connect with his mother's parents and he lies to them, like he doesn't tell them that he's a con artist. And he also does not tell them that he has not talked to his parents in 5 years. So while being secretive, he is able to like get information about his parents through his grandparents. And he is also not caught, in the dramatic way it's shown in the movie. In the book and in real life, he is just like at a grocery store shopping when agents show up and then they find him and arrest him. But in the movie, we see that he is kept in a French prison cell and he is suffering from malnutrition and he's just living in filth. And Hanratty essentially saves him and tries to get him back to the States. But while they are still in France, Frank tries to run away. And then while they're on the plane getting back to the States, Frank does escape out of the plane and run away. And this was the case in the book where the French prison system, it was horrible and he was kept in this dark, dirty cell, just like the movie shows. And his hair and nails grew out and he was severely sick. And an American comes to check on him, but the American can do nothing. And he's like, if you were being treated differently because you were an American, I could help you. But they treat all of their prisoners this, so there's nothing I can do to help. But then he only served 6 months in France, and then from there he was taken to Sweden, and then he was tried in Sweden, and he went to jail there. But he says that the Swedish prison was super nice, and it was basically like living in an apartment, and you had food delivered, and so it was just very posh. And yeah, the reason he went from France to Sweden is because he broke the law in so many countries. And so he was going to spend basically the rest of his life going to one country, being tried, serving his time. And then once his time was done, he would be shipped to the next country where he would be tried and serve time. But the Swedish authority, though, took pity on him because they were like, man, you're going to spend the rest of your life going from country to country. And so it is thanks to the Swedish authority that he is extradited to America. And they decide that America can just deal with him and he won't have to go country to country. But on the flight back to the States, Frank decides that he doesn't want to spend time in jail. He's like, even if I'm not bouncing from country to country, and even if this isn't, like the French prison where I almost died, I still don't want to be in prison. And so he does do the escape out of the toilet from the plane. But in the movie, like I said, he escapes. He runs away because he heard about his father's death and it triggers him. Whereas in the book, he just escapes because he's like, I don't want to go to prison. And in the movie, once he runs out of the plane, he goes to his mom's house and he sees his mom with her new husband and her new child. And he is outside of the house when, Hanratty shows up and he is arrested once again. And so then he is put into prison. But then while in prison, Hanratty realizes how useful he could be to the FBI in catching forgeries. And so Hanratty tells him hey, you can serve out the rest of your time as an FBI employee helping us catch forgeries, which is what he ends up doing. Whereas in the book, after he escapes out of the plane, he is quickly caught soon after. He is put in American prison for a few years and he gets out on parole and he's just working these random odd jobs. And then one day he's like, man, I know more about check forgery than anything else. So that's what I should be doing. Not forging checks, but I should be in that line of work. And so he starts to call up different banks telling them hey, I have a lot of information on how you can prevent check forgery. So if you're interested, I can do a seminar and tell you guys about it. And so they agree. And then this seminar is so successful that other banks are telling other banks and word gets around. And then eventually he starts working for the FBI. And then to talk about some other changes. So a great scene in the movie is when he is still in high school with his parents. He goes to a new school and he starts pretending to be the substitute teacher for his French class for a whole week. And it's such a great scene, but this unfortunately did not happen in the book. But he did pretend to be a professor at Brigham Young University in Utah. And he said he loved it and he loved teaching and he would have stayed longer if he could have. However, when you're a con man, you can't stay anywhere for long. So eventually he did have to leave. And then of course we have the iconic scene where he needs to get through the airport, which is filled with undercover FBI agents. And so he's like, how can I get out of this airport without being seen? And so he goes to colleges and hires a bunch of women to be stewardesses. And so the stewardesses are blocking him and everybody's paying attention to them and he is able to get past the FBI. And this happened in the book, but it wasn't because he was trying to be sneaky and hide from the FBI. But he does go to colleges in September and he tells them hey, I have this program where I'm taking a certain amount of women on a European tour for Pan Am. And the tour happens the following summer. So it's a year later. And so he does this tour with these stewardesses and he tells them that they're just taking photos, promotional photos for Pan Am. And so he gets them the uniform and he hires a photographer and they take the photos and he sends them to Pan Am. And so Pan Am gets these promotional photos being wait, what? Who's taking these? Who's sending this to us? And so they were just very confused. And then once, this Pan Am tour is over, he sends these women back to their homes in the United States. And then the FBI was able to find some of them and ask about the details. But when it comes to book versus movie, like I said, the biggest change the movie made was his desire to find that perfect family again. We have the scene where he sees his parents dancing and he's just like, wow, they have the perfect romance. And he's just so happy with how things are. And so then when they divorce, how much that crushed him. And then he sees Brenda's parents and he again is like, wow, that's what I want. And then at the end, when he hears his dad dies and then he goes sees his mom just living a new life with a new family and just how heartbreaking that is for him. And how he just is used to living life on the run. And at the end, he's working for the FBI, but he has the weekend off. And so Hanratty is like, yeah, you can do whatever you want. And Hanratty, because he knows him, he knows that he's going to try to run away. And so he catches him as he's leaving, pretending to be a pilot again. And Hanratty has this moment where he's like, hey, I get it. It's easier to live the lie than it is to live the truth. So if you want to keep living on the run, pretending to live a lie, that's up to you, essentially. But this moment where Frank is given the freedom, because Hanratty is like, I'm not going to chase you anymore. In that moment, Frank decides that he actually doesn't want to live life on the run anymore. And he does come back and he stays and works for the FBI. And just the relationship between him and Hanratty, he would call every Christmas, the two of them, and would end up talking. And so I really like the relationship they had in the movie. Hanratty wanted to catch Frank, and Frank wanted to escape Hanratty, but at the same time they did have this respect for each other and this understanding because they were similar in some ways. And so I love that added relationship because like I said, there was the FBI guy who found him and the two of them did have a friendship even after he was caught. But the movie definitely embellished that much more, and they just really embellished the family aspect more. And because of that, I like the movie more, even if it's strays from the truth. This is one case where I'm fine with Hollywood, taking its liberties because it made for a better story at the end of the day. And it's not I hated the book. I just think the book was just kind of meh. So if you really like the movie and you're curious about the true story, then sure, read it. But ultimately, I would say to just stick with the movie. Which, getting into the truth of this book to begin with, I say that the movie embellished the truth, but it sounds like the book embellished the truth too. So I will link to an article by the New York Post where they talked about Abagnale, about how he lied a lot about the things he did. And so a quote from the article says, "He did forge checks, masquerade as pilot, sit in a few jump seats, escape a jailhouse, and go to prison in Europe. However, Abagnale never pretended to be a professor at BYU or a physician in Georgia, and he never posed as a lawyer in the Baton Rouge Attorney General's office." And in the article, they have different quotes from him, and it seems like he blamed Stan Redding, the ghostwriter, on lying about what he did. And he says that Stan Redding over-dramatized and exaggerated some of the story. "He always reminded me that he was just telling a story and not writing my biography." And then in the article, we also hear a story from a woman named Paula Campbell, and she was a flight attendant who Abagnale was taken with. And he was kind of persistent, overly persistent, where she became uncomfortable, but eventually she said yes, she would date him. And he even met her family, and her family was very taken with him, and they fell in love with him, and they welcomed him with open arms. And then he ended up stealing from them. And then he disappeared, and the truth came out, and the family just felt so betrayed. And so Paula says, "He said he never hurt little people, just went after the big business. But that's what sticks in my craw. My mama's heart was broken." And so just how people will act nobody got hurt. It was just these big corporations. But it's no, you were still manipulative to these innocent people who were open and trusting, and you took advantage of them. So don't act like you didn't hurt any individuals because you did. Which kind of, I love movies about con artists. But the truth is, in real life, con artists are just such horrible people. And I talk about this in Matchstick Men, book versus movie, which I love the movie Matchstick Men. But again, these people in real life are horrible people who are so manipulative, and they're delusional, again, thinking oh, I don't take money from people. People just give me the money, but it's because you manipulate them and you trick them. So yeah, they might be giving you the money, but it's because you're taking advantage of them. So anyway, people will act no one was hurt by this. But yeah, people were hurt, okay? But yeah, and it was interesting because in this article, they showed different documents, and there was a letter from BYU where someone reached out to them wanting to verify that Frank had worked there for a semester. But BYU wrote being yeah, we've had a lot of people ask us, and through the years, we have never been able to find evidence that he ever worked here. And obviously he had aliases, but even with his aliases, they were no, like that summer he claims to have been here, or that semester, whatever it was. They're like, we have no evidence of that. And also people were doubting him. Like in the 80s when this book was coming out, people would hear him speak and they were like, I don't think that's true. But because we didn't have the internet, these skeptics were like isolated to their local communities where they would write about this, but it never got out to become a nationwide thing. And so Abagnale just kept getting away with this lie, which the fact that if he lied about all of this, and it was turned into a book, which he made money off of. And he was on, to tell the truth. And then it became a movie and a play. Like, that's just like the ultimate long con, right? So it's not like, oh, like he wasn't even a con artist after all. Like he still was a con artist who like forged checks. Maybe it wasn't as many as he claims, but he still was a con artist. And ultimately, even if he embellished his con artist ways, it led to him just conning people on a whole nother level, right? Because he got all this fame from the movie and everything, only for all these decades later for us to realize like, wait, like a small fraction of that is true, but so much of it isn't. So yeah, the story isn't quite as impressive in that respect, but nonetheless, I still like the movie. And my favorite part of the movie, like I said, the aspects of the movie I like the most weren't even in the book anyway. So I still say the movie is worth watching and I did really like it. If the book really is fake, then I would be like, why read it? Because it wasn't that good anyway. So definitely stick with the movie on this one. So anyway, thank you so much for watching, but let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. And if you like Steven Spielberg movies, then maybe you would enjoy my episode on, I'm trying to think of what other Steven Spielberg movies I've covered. I know I did one like just recently. I mean, I did The Color Purple. Oh, Jaws. I recently did Jaws, which was Steven Spielberg's first big movie. So I've also covered Jurassic Park. That again is just as a podcast episode. But anyway, I'll link to Jaws. That's a recent Steven Spielberg one I have covered. So go ahead and watch that if you want more Spielberg content. And yeah, thank you so much for watching and I will see you next time. Bye.